Henry Dolger was born into a working-class family in San Francisco in 1896. His parents, John and Julia Dolger, owned and operated a small German bakery in the city's Barbary Coast area. They had 3 sons, Frank, Henry, and John. At that time, it was a tough neighborhood, lined with bars and brothels that catered to the sailors who came to port a few blocks away.
They were a family of very modest means. My father was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth.
He was very proud of the fact that he made his first money after the earthquake and fire, and that he would have been, 9 or 10, and he'd go through the rubble, and he picked out the window weights, the sash weights, which were made out of lead, and he sold that and made, according to him, $300, which was, must have been a huge amount of money.
When Henry was in 8th grade, his father died. He quit school and delivered groceries to help support the family. Henry never earned a high school diploma, let alone a college degree. As an adult, he claimed, "I'd flunk a 5th grade arithmetic test."
When you look at the neighborhood that he came from, the experiences that he had as a very young man, that all played a part in molding his character, and perhaps his ambition was determined during those very early years.
Henry worked at a variety of jobs to make ends meet, including a stint in the Merchant Marines and another as a bartender. During the Prohibition years, he even sold bootleg liquor, a phase of his career he hoped would be forgotten.
He was a little embarrassed about being in illegal activity, but my mother used to talk about it, and according to her, they used to drive down to Half Moon Bay and pick up whiskey, Canadian whiskey, that had been shipped down, and then they'd drive it back up to the city and sell it. And the bootlegging went on until Elliot Ness, who was a real guy, really hunting down all the bootleggers, finally turned his attention to San Francisco. My mother was almost caught delivering alcohol to the Fairmont Hotel, and as the federal agents were running up the stairs, she was hiding behind a column, and my father saw this, and that was the end. They never touched it again. It scared him to death.
Meanwhile, Henry's older brother Frank had begun a successful career in land speculating and was teaching Henry the business. Henry bought his first piece of property in 1922 in San Francisco's Sunset District. This area was little more than empty streets and sand dunes at the time, but Henry was able to make a career of buying and selling unimproved lots.
Things went well for a number of years, but there was a period in which they were not able to sell lots. And of course, my father was heavily invested in unimproved real estate in the Sunset District. He needed to go into the building business because it was the only way that he could generate a cash flow at that time.
Frank Dolger died of gangrene, leaving Henry and John to carry on in the business alone. Henry did triple duty as contractor, salesman, and head of the company.
In those days, the thought was you really could be anything that you wanted to be if you just worked hard at it. And I think that's what my dad did.
Henry and John Dolger's fledgling company produced simple but solid houses that suited moderate-income buyers.
And this was a man that liked kids, and he was always very nice to me as we lived out there. As I grew a little bit older, he used to tell me to stick to my drawing. He liked the idea that I'd like to draw. He said, take that mechanical drawing and study all that stuff, and he said, someday maybe you'll come work for me. And I did just that.
Ed Hageman joined Dolger in 1937 at age 21. Other early employees included building designer Chester Dolphin and superintendent of construction Carl Vidal. Henry Dolger was almost universally admired by his staff.
As an employer, his employees worshiped the ground he walked on. Not only did he have this mystique of success, but also he was fun to work for, demanding to work for, but also fun to work for.
Men who started working for him as laborers years before were still with him, and he knew their families, he knew everything about them. Henry was quite a guy.
During much of the 1930s, Henry Dolger was the largest home builder in America. During World War II, Dolger offered his services to the Army Corps of Engineers, resulting in about 3,000 units of military apartments in South San Francisco, Benicia, Vallejo, and Oakland. His total output in San Francisco was estimated at 11,000 housing units, but by the 1940s, buildable land in the city was becoming scarce. As the war came to a close, Dolger placed a bid on a 1,350-acre tract of land just south of San Francisco.
In the building business, the other individuals in their firms thought Henry was making a big mistake. He had all the income he needed from all those apartment units and other things that he had done before.
"Come and help me build a city," Henry Dolger told his employees. Building that city, Westlake, would be his mission for the next 20 years.
On Sundays, my dad would take me for Sunday drives. And there's one Sunday, I remember he drove me out beyond San Francisco. And my father said a few things that I knew were important to him, and this is perhaps the reason that I'd never forgotten it. But he said, I'm going to build a city here someday. The city will have all the necessities.
Henry Dolger's vision for Westlake was not simply to build a huge tract of houses, but a complete community. Only a handful of builders in the post-war era attempted to do this, with varying degrees of success. Dolger saw this complete community approach as a way to give Westlake a competitive edge over other builders' offerings. He had to offer San Francisco residents a good reason to leave their established neighborhoods for a seemingly remote location.
He did it. Why? Because he wanted Westlake to be a success. That wasn't just houses, he was building homes for people.
The first factor that made Westlake a viable suburb was its shared border with San Francisco, which made city attractions and job opportunities truly accessible. The location also benefited from several existing golf courses that partially bordered it, creating greenbelt space around the community. Millions of cubic yards of earth were moved to flatten the rough terrain into gentle, buildable slopes. Home sites along hillside streets were terraced to create better visibility, taking full advantage of spectacular views of San Francisco and the Pacific Ocean. The layout of Westlake streets was undertaken with similar care. The area's two largest thoroughfares had almost no houses located directly on them. Instead, buffer streets with landscaping or setback hills were created to distance the homes from traffic and noise. Dolger and his planners laid out the entire Westlake development utilizing a neighborhood unit structure, wherein homes were grouped within a kidney-shaped perimeter street that conformed to the contours of the land. This structure created gently curving streets, better traffic flow, and a natural clustering of buildings that was quieter and more aesthetically pleasing than a grid layout.
If I want to be transported back to the 1950s, I can drive down 280, I can drive down Skyline, and you just get to this sea of just red, orange, yellow, blue, green. It's just these happy little houses. And how special is that? How exciting and different.
Henry Dolger was clearly very familiar with the FHA bulletins that were issued in the late 1930s, which guided ideal subdivision design. Some of the features you see in Westlake that embody these FHA guidelines include the hierarchical arrangement of arterial streets and subsidiary residential streets, the long blocks, and the lack of four-way intersections, which are notoriously dangerous. In many ways, Westlake is really a textbook example of FHA design guidelines as applied to a subdivision.
Many of Westlake's neighborhood units contained a school, a park, or both. Most often, these were located either in the geographic center of each unit or on its perimeter, making them easily accessible to every house within that neighborhood unit. This also minimized the number of children who had to cross major thoroughfares on their way to school.
He recognized a need for some green park areas, and he picked spots where he said, we'll make a park site out of this. He worked out an arrangement with the city where they would take some small sites for little neighborhood parks and spread them around. And he left those spaces open, gave them to the city, and improved them.
Another part of Dolger's strategy for Westlake was to offer a range of housing possibilities for buyers at various stages of life. Offerings ran the gamut from studio apartments to houses with 4 bedrooms and 2 baths that met the needs of larger families.
As their incomes grew and they had the means to move out of the apartments, his hope and expectation would be that they would want to continue to live in the community, and then he would be able to build them a home.
Most residential developers during the post-war era avoided building apartments for a number of reasons. First off, they didn't want to be saddled with the construction costs and the carrying costs and just the hassles of managing rental property. Most wanted to build the single-family houses and move on to fresh pastures. Rental housing was typically seen as potentially lower class and disruptive of maintaining value over the long term. But I think Dolger really understood that offering other housing types was to his own benefit and to the community's benefit.
Perhaps the most unique aspect of Westlake's community layout was the careful integration of commercial and residential spaces. The Westlake Town and Country Shopping Center was located in the geographic center of the first 6 units, making average travel times to and from the center as short as possible. Clusters of apartments were built around the shopping center, allowing the denser population of the apartments to access the center most easily, and creating a physical buffer between the bustle of the commercial area and the houses. Dolger also constructed rentable office space and a large medical-dental building in the center. A new post office and public library were constructed 1 block away, truly making it the center of town of Westlake.
So the whole thing was planned so that really people didn't have to leave Westlake. They say that most of the people that lived here worked in San Francisco, and that was it. We'd go off in the morning and carpools or a bus or whatever. But it wasn't as though the family was left out in the boondocks.
Residents could live, work, attend schools and churches, shop, visit parks, eat at restaurants, and get medical care, all without leaving the boundaries of their neighborhood.
There was a lot of publicity at that time about Levittown and then the place in Southern California called Lakewood, I think, that were probably bigger than Westlake, but I doubt that they were planned as meticulously as here.
In 1950, National Real Estate and Building Journal magazine ran a cover story about Westlake entitled, "Foresight Sells a Subdivision." It said of the project, "A study of the steps taken in developing Westlake forms a good case study of subdivision planning for small and large operative builders alike. Even in the 21st century, many of the planning principles applied in Westlake are still considered state-of-the-art." If Westlake was to be a viable post-war community, working-class people and returning GIs would have to be able to afford its homes. Henry Dolger found innovative ways to keep construction costs down and selling prices within the reach of as many buyers as possible. When the war ended, Dolger had the foresight to purchase a number of surplus U.S. military vehicles at auction, including several troop transports, ambulances, and trucks. He adapted these for use in the Westlake construction fleet, which consisted of about 150 vehicles total. Dolger then made the pivotal decision to build and staff his own lumber mill on the Westlake job site.
So he brought rough timber down, set up a yard for it, and started producing almost everything he needed lumber-wise in that lumber yard, and found it was a very efficient way to do business. And he didn't have to worry about did he have enough of a given material. He just produced it.
Dolger chose to build Westlake's houses almost entirely out of redwood, an expensive but extremely durable timber. He then took the function of his lumber mill a step further by actually pre-cutting most of the lumber for each house. Each floor plan was broken down into a list of components and the boards were cut. They were then numbered, bundled, and delivered to each foundation on lumber carriers.
And all we needed to do as framing carpenters was peel off the wood that was delivered to the home, and every piece was basically pre-cut and ready to be nailed into place.
He did the same thing with doors and windows. He could take all of the pieces that were cut off and save them in some storage bins, bring stuff back to the mill in the storage bins. He used every bit of the lumber that way.
Westlake's construction workforce consisted of about 1,000 people at the height of the development. They were organized into specialized crews for framing, millwork, roofing, siding, and other functions.
All your contractors are lined up sequentially so that as soon as one craft is completed with their work, another craft is brought in. There would be a single crew that would do nothing but pour foundations, and they became experts in pouring foundations. The same people that poured the foundations last week would be the same people pouring the foundations a week after, the month after, the year after.
Pretty soon you get good at it. Thing that used to take you an hour, you could do in a half an hour. And as we got better at it, Henry knew darn well that we were making money for him because our methods were good.
Subcontractors were hired for plumbing, electrical, furnaces, stucco, and tile. Dolger often employed crews from 2 different companies simultaneously, so they would effectively be competing against each other. He also paid his subcontractors faster than other builders did, which allowed him to negotiate the lowest labor rates. Henry and John Dolger held frequent meetings with construction foreman Carl Vidal and his team leaders, asking them for ideas that could improve efficiency further.
Every time they wanted a figure on how much it cost to frame a house, they run it past my crew right down to the minutes of how long it took to do things.
He was still willing to experiment, to see if there was a better way to build a home or a faster way.
Dolger was reportedly the first West Coast builder to abandon lath and plaster wall construction for a new material called sheetrock, which was faster and less expensive to install. His competitors ridiculed that choice, but Dolger found sheetrock's efficiency too significant to ignore.
And within a few years, his key competitors were using sheetrock, and they began to understand that yes, you could continue to provide affordable housing if you were willing to apply new technologies and new products.
Another important factor in the efficiency of Westlake's building process was the design of the houses themselves. This challenge went primarily to Chester Dolphin. Dolphin strove to design using standard dimensions and components to keep costs down. He often employed split-level floor plans in Westlake with standard 8-foot ceilings, but the flow of vertical space between the 2 living levels made the rooms seem more spacious. Many of the later models were 2-story floor plans featuring an efficient utility cluster with the kitchen and bathroom next to each other, thereby minimizing plumbing materials and labor costs. Heating systems followed the same principle. This kind of efficiency earned Henry Dolger the nickname the Henry Ford of housing.
I think he admired Henry Ford because Henry Ford was looking towards building an automobile that the average wage earner could afford. My dad modeled his career after that Henry Ford philosophy. He wanted to build a good product. He wanted it to be lasting. He wanted it to be affordable.
Dolger's company completed up to 7 houses a day in Westlake. The homes started selling at about $10,000 in 1949. For many veterans, owning a house in Westlake was less expensive than renting a San Francisco apartment of similar square footage. In 1950, 96% of Westlake's homes were purchased while they were still under construction, with some on the market for as little as 30 minutes. Not bad for tract houses built on a site that real estate experts had called untouchable. Westlake and other post-war suburbs were born of a time that was forward-thinking and future-oriented. After 15 years of depression and war, Americans were ready for a look that was bright, clean, and new. This paved the way for acceptance of an optimistic design aesthetic for everyday living. John and Henry Dolger and their designers had to create a neighborhood look that fit the idealized post-war vision of suburbia. The key to Westlake's design aesthetic was a combination of rigid visual consistency within the overall community, paired with very deliberate architectural variations for each house. Thousands of the homes came with the identical species of tree planted in their front yards. All visual clutter was either hidden or eliminated in an effort to give the development a picture-perfect appearance.
So from the very first unit of Westlake, he moved the poles into the rear yards so that you don't have to see all of these wires coming from a pole over to a house as you go down the block. That system was well in advance of what other builders were doing, and yet it wasn't as expensive as putting pole lines totally underground.
As head of the building division of the company, John Dolger exerted a great deal of influence over Westlake's architecture. To create the homes, John and Henry turned primarily to two men who had been longtime employees, Chester Dolphin and Ed Hageman. Dolphin continued to turn out floor plans that were highly livable and easy to build. After World War II, Hageman had left to form his own design practice in Marin County, but Henry Dolger's remaining designers, who had made their careers in the Sunset District, were not accustomed to creating detached houses with varied roof lines, which constituted a very important part of Westlake's suburban aesthetic.
He called me up this one day and he wanted to know if I would be interested in looking over some stuff that he had in mind that I might be able to help out on for him. And Henry being my mentor, and I naturally said right away, yes, sure, what can I do?
Hageman was hired back as a consultant to design house exteriors. His first set of drawings impressed Dolger and helped him set the visual tone for the entire development. Dolger made the very deliberate decision that each block should include homes of both traditional and modern architectural styles, often literally next door to each other. Given this mandate for variety, Hageman faced the daunting task of creating an adequate range of elevations using only 8 basic floor plans in the first 2 subdivisions.
I would go over and I'd pick up the plans that he was talking about, and I'd bring them back to my office over in Marin County, and then sketch various elevations, the fronts, the roof plans, stair entrances. He bought every one of them.
The first 5 subdivisions of Westlake, built between 1949 and 1953, were the most varied in terms of exterior architecture. Most of these early homes were split-level plans. Endless variations of architectural detailing were ultimately employed.
And this, in a nutshell, the trick of the thing is just make each house look as differently as you can, change the window style, change everything as you can, but still retain that same floor plan.
As a result of Hageman's work, Westlake's streetscapes were far more varied than Levittown's rows of nearly identical Cape Cods or other post-war housing tracts. Ironically, Westlake's most distinctive home design was never supposed to be built at all.
And I drew one up as a joke where I slanted the roofs in different directions, made the living room windows come up at like an angle, and I put it in with the rest of them. And he got to it, and he stared for a minute, and he said, this is pretty good. And he was serious. And I said, Henry, I said, you must be kidding. I said, that's a joke. I said, that's just a joke.
Hageman's joke, which he nicknamed the Fish and Chips House, turned out to be well ahead of its time. The use of canted windows and oddly pitched roof lines later became a staple of 1950s architecture, mostly in commercial buildings. That style, which was later named Googie, reached the zenith of its popularity around 1959, almost a decade after Dolger built his first Fish and Chips House. Many of Westlake's early homes took a tongue-in-cheek approach to modernism.
They're really different. There's really nothing like them anywhere else in the country. Dolger's embrace of, for lack of a better term, this sort of pop modern aesthetic is unusual, I think.
The period from 1954 to 1957 represented a second architectural phase in Westlake. Efficient full basement style floor plans became dominant. These layouts were structurally similar to Doelger's row houses in the Sunset District, which had all the living area on the second story over an undeveloped space and a garage. From this point onward, John Doelger and the drafting department shouldered a greater share of the design responsibilities. But when each block was laid out and drawings of every house were put up on the drafting room walls, Henry Dolger had the final say as to how each streetscape would look.
So if you walked through the drafting room, on one side you would be looking at all the front elevations on the right-hand side of the block, and you'd be looking at all the front elevations on the left-hand side of the block.
And then they would play around with them, moving them back and forth, and they would put colors on them.
And that block would not be built until he had personally walked through that drafting room and approved not only the elevations that were to appear on each lot, but the color scheme for each home. It was that kind of interest that he took in his product.
A 1957 recession left many middle-class families with less money to spend on new homes, so 1958 and 59 were difficult years in the home building business. These years saw a third major type of house built in Westlake. It was basically a ranch style that had the shorter side of its rectangular plan facing the street. By 1960, the economy had recovered, and Westlake's houses reflected the upswing. Two-story homes dominated again, this time with even larger floor plans that usually included 3 or more bedrooms and 2 baths on the main level, and a full basement with room for expansion. Garage doors often sported simple but modern design motifs. A wider range of masonry products also adorned the home's exteriors in these later subdivisions. The variety of styles and colors was always carefully planned to avoid monotony.
And it was a deliberate program that worked well and provided the variety that you see as you drive through Westlake.
Today, one can still walk through Westlake and feel a sense of optimism in the style of these unique houses. The same feeling that drew a generation of San Franciscans to these orderly tree-lined streets half a century ago. One of the most unique aspects of Westlake was that almost all its commercial buildings and apartments were built by the same company as its houses. So unlike most neighborhoods, the larger buildings are all of the same time period and share a singular aesthetic. The most obvious extension of the architectural style of Westlake's houses could be found in the Westlake apartments.
You will see some similarity in architecture between the apartments on Park Plaza Drive and Lake Merced Boulevard and the homes that my father was building at the time. My father liked the colonial look. He liked the French mansard look. And these are the styles of architecture that you'll see on those two streets.
Most of the early Westlake apartment buildings were U-shaped and built around landscape courtyards. But over the course of many years of development, the apartments changed, not only in terms of form, but style. Always aware of the need for variety, Doelger even created a so-called international plaza of apartments with somewhat over-the-top interpretations of Greek and Roman architecture. By the 1960s, Doelger had developed an affinity for Asian design motifs and counted the apartments built in this style among his favorites. Later apartments were generally built around an enclosed courtyard and employed a broader but period-appropriate range of exterior materials. Many featured relatively elaborate lobbies that carried the exterior architectural themes inside, often incorporating small indoor gardens, special millwork, floating stairs, and, despite Westlake's cool climate, swimming pools.
You say, okay, swimming pool, Westlake, is that congruent? To my father it was.
Nowhere is the consistency in Westlake's architectural style as noteworthy as in Joe's of Westlake, a restaurant and bar that opened on October 15, 1956. Stylistically, Joe's is essentially a giant Westlake house, featuring the ubiquitous repeating expanses of wood-framed glass and slanted roofs that characterize many of the homes. Even Joe's interior finishes are directly copied from those of the homes built in 1956. Designed primarily by Chester Dolphin, the restaurant was his opportunity to take advantage of natural light and open planning principles far beyond what was possible within the small footprint of the single-family houses. By the 1950s, the concept of the drive-in restaurant had become an American institution. Westlake's version was called Tips, a small but striking building with wraparound windows, a slanted roof, and a long roof overhang that shielded cars and pedestrians from the elements. It is interesting to compare Tips' architecture to Westlake's Fish and Chips house, designed by Ed Hageman, which featured a similar slanted roofline and wraparound windows. Likewise, no self-respecting 1950s suburb could be complete without its own bowling alley. Westlake's answer was Swanson's Westlake Bowl, which opened in August 1958. The 52-lane alley was the largest in Northern California and featured a number of forward-thinking amenities, including one brand new invention, automatic pin-setting machines.
This was more than a bowling center. It was a restaurant. We had a nursery to take care of the children. We had a banquet room. It was a social center of Westlake, really.
Like the other large buildings, Swanson's Westlake Bowl had a close relative in the neighborhood's residential architecture, bearing a close resemblance to the double roofline house that featured a flat roof with a secondary roof overhang supported by two sets of canted poles. A similar geometry can be seen in Westlake Bowl's flat roof, which was paired with an extended driveway overhang supported by two sets of slanted beams. The main commercial area of Westlake was designed as a traditional main street with retail stores on each side. But Dolger decided to abandon that plan in favor of a cluster of stores connected by pedestrian walkways and surrounded by a parking lot. It's commonplace today, but at the time it was a radical new concept in architecture. The shopping mall.
At one point, he brought up the idea of shopping centers, and this was something that he had studied. He'd been studying, and he actually went to, I think, one in Los Angeles, and he explained it to me. And he said, you know, what you do is you have two anchor stores, which in this case was Penny's, I think, at one end, and the Market at the other, and then smaller shops in the middle. And he was very excited about this. It was a new concept.
So the shopping center, which originally started out to have a street running through the center of it, ended up with a mall through the center of it, pedestrian mall. The strange thing is right now is that currently the mall has been removed and a street has been put back there by the current owners of the shopping center.
Chester Dolphin and architect Lloyd Gartner were the primary designers of the Westlake Shopping Center. They consistently opted for large windows and wide pedestrian walkways in the mall, imbuing it with a great deal of natural light and spaciousness. Flat roof lines, pole-supported overhangs, a space-age fountain, and minimalist landscaping gave the center a modern character. But in the end, its emphasis on pedestrian access is what made the Westlake Shopping Center more than just a collection of stores. It was a place to spend time and hosted all sorts of entertainment programs and community events.
He, I think, thought of it as a sort of a gathering place for people where they could go and be comfortable near their homes. And that's what he did. He wanted to really make this a community.
As a group, Westlake's larger buildings shared a great deal of architectural style with the houses and with each other. Their design unity is what makes Westlake a perfect case study in mid-century style. Although most of Westlake's architecture was dismissed as irrelevant by the professional journals of the day, the neighborhood's schools had the distinction of being widely praised by both the architectural community and the mass media during their development. Credit for this goes mainly to architect Mario Ciampi, who between 1950 and 1960 designed the majority of Westlake's schools. The Olympia School offered Ciampi a chance to put to use on a small scale several principles that would later become central themes in his work. He argued that the coastal climate of Westlake made painting and maintaining wood expensive. Therefore, Olympia would employ industrial materials, which would be more durable in the long run and result in lower maintenance costs.
Mario designed this a series of basically inwardly focused schools that blocked the fog, and well, not the fog, but the wind, and also this incorporation of industrial materials like steel and concrete that were much more suitable to the climate here. They stood up a lot better than the sort of lightly framed, wood frame schools that you frequently see in most California suburbs.
Olympia set the tone for the larger and more ambitious buildings that were to come. Westmore High School was the largest single building in all of Westlake, set atop one of the highest hills in the area. Despite the school's size, its unusual structural shapes made it dynamic and energetic. Students were greeted by dramatic entrance portals, featuring giant V-shaped supports. Large openings in the concrete roof let in light and created a transitional zone between the exterior and interior spaces. The central feature of Westmore was the landscape courtyard spanning the entire length of the building. One side of this open courtyard featured a massive window wall of shatterproof glass that enclosed the gymnasium, blurring the lines between indoor and outdoor space. These functional and aesthetic innovations ultimately earned Westmore an American Institute of Architects National Honor Award, and the school was featured in Life and Architectural Forum magazines. It was even pictured on the front cover of Fortune magazine in October 1958. Although most architects specializing in schools typically duplicated their designs whenever possible, Ciampi's sensitivity to each school's site and purpose prevented him from doing this. His Vista Mar School of 1959 was very different from Westmore. Ciampi, like most architects of the day, was not at all enamored with Westlake's residential architecture. To this end, he designed Vista Mar to completely eliminate the outside neighborhood from the students' view, instead focusing their attention on an inner courtyard that was landscaped. The overall impression created by the building was one of lightness and elegance. Vista Mar received the Gold Medal of Honor from the Architecture League of New York and appeared in Life and Architectural Forum magazines along with Westmore High School. Ciampi's final school in Westlake was the Fernando Rivera Elementary School of 1960, which again featured interior courtyards dominated by glass, but with an unusual roof comprised of a series of folded plywood panels. The school earned him another National Honor Award from the American Institute of Architects. The schools that Mario Ciampi designed in Daly City over the course of 10 years ultimately resulted in over a dozen architecture awards and brought national attention to Westlake as a home to good design. Half a century later, every one of Ciampi's Westlake school buildings is still in use. He fondly recalled his work in Westlake as an expression of his fundamental belief that architecture is an art form that can enhance the educational process.
The architecture should contribute to an awareness of your learning capabilities. I do believe that Ciampi really brought a lot of joy in architecture through these schools.
Westlake has proven to be a popular place to live ever since it was built.
You know, they were built very, very well. They're small homes, but they were designed and built so well. And I think that the fact that they're each different and they have their own little spin really is unique to the owners and to the people that are interested in these houses. We want individuality. We want to be able to have our own little piece of art there that we come home to every day.
He was one of the early pioneers of the concept of a planned community, a community with schools and shopping facilities and parks.
So Dolger really had to create something that was completely different. And I think that's one of the things that makes Westlake so appealing today is that it's not a carbon copy or clone of the typical suburban offering of the post-war era.
Henry Dolger's vision for neighborhood planning and his aesthetic sensibilities resulted in a truly complete suburban community that was far more than a collection of bland tract houses. The homes have served their purpose as durable structures for everyday life. Beyond function, the neighborhood has style, optimistic style that carries over from the homes into every building in the community. In its own unpretentious way, the architecture of Westlake delivers on the post-war promise of good design, combining functionality with a healthy dose of mid-century quirkiness and character.